some people, it does work best to look at the speaker and to sit still and have crisscross applesauce. Not me, and sounds like not you, and not my children.
How can we support kids' social and emotional growth without just managing their behavior? Many parents and educators know about whole body listening, but what if we focused on whole body regulation instead? And how does co-regulation actually work in everyday moments? Speech-language pathologist and author Elizabeth Sautter is here to help us rethink these ideas. That's straight ahead on episode 260. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and this is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
What is neurodiversity?
You see the world differently.
Autism spectrum.
Gifted.
Complexities that are inherently inside.
ADHD.
Dysgraphia.
Tourette's.
All brains are different.
You are exactly what this world needs.
This is the
Neurodiversity
Podcast.
One of the philosophies that I live by is that life is too short for uncomfortable shoes. I made this decision in my early 20s, probably because I was never really coordinated enough to wear heels, but also because the logic of being in pain for something aesthetic just didn't make sense to me. From a young age, neurodivergent people are taught to push through discomfort, even when it's completely optional. We stay in environments that drain us, force ourselves into social norms that don't make sense, follow routines that everyone swears by but just don't work for our brains. And we do it because we've been told that's what's normal. This starts really early for our kids. Kids are constantly expected to comply with rules and routines that weren't built with them in mind. They're told to sit still when their brains need movement, to work quietly when they process best by talking things through, and to follow rigid schedules when their focus and energy fluctuate throughout the day. And when they struggle, instead of adjusting the environment, they're often told to try harder, to squeeze themselves into something that just doesn't fit. This is a big part of the conversation I'm having with Elizabeth today, and I'm looking forward to sharing it with you. Also, if you're looking for even more ideas and tools to support neurodivergent young people, make sure to check out the limited series podcast, Creating Neurodiversity Affirming Schools. It's co-hosted by Amanda Morin and me, and it's a supplement to our recently released book, although it's great as a standalone resource too. You can find it anywhere you listen to podcasts, at neurodiversityaffirmingschools.com, or click the link in the show notes. My conversation with Elizabeth is up in a minute.
Previously on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
If you have a kid who really is struggling with those transitions and having like massive meltdowns after gaming, for example, then you may have a kid who can't game during the school week, or you may have a kid who actually, maybe you need a visual schedule. Maybe this is something you work on with their therapist or another practitioner to try to help figure out how to make these transitions. They may need a really explicit menu of activities that bring them back into their body, for example. For many kids, it might just be helpful to remember, like, oh, you might need to go to the bathroom or eat or drink water or do some push-ups after you game to like get back in your body. But for kids who are really struggling, it might be helpful to have a list, and like, and you're like telling them to get off the game and handing them their list, and they have to like go through the checklist, and this is what we do. And if it doesn't work, that game may not work for your family if every single time they play it, they're going to throw the controller.
That's episode 158. Find it wherever you get your podcasts.
Today, I'm speaking with Elizabeth Sautter. Elizabeth is a speech-language pathologist, speaker, author, and trainer with a special focus on social communication, emotional regulation, and executive functioning. She wrote the book Make Social and Emotional Learning Stick, the picture book Listen, Learn, and Grow, and has created a variety of other resources, including an online course and a supportive community for parents. Elizabeth also works closely with the Zones of Regulation team, serving as a trainer and co-authoring several zones-related children's books, card decks, and games that many educators and families know and love. Elizabeth, thanks for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
The subject matter we talk about when supporting neurodivergent kids is really evolving, and your work is such a great example of that. Whole body listening is something you helped develop years ago, and a lot of parents and educators have heard of whole body listening, but our understanding of it has been shifting, and you've come to think of it as whole body regulation now. So why don't we start the conversation by going back to the things that led you to develop whole body listening in the first place?
Absolutely. So by trade, I'm a speech pathologist, and I, got my master's in communicative disorders and sciences, and we were trained with the medical model. And when that happens, you dive into assessment and overarching traits to then diagnose, and then thinking about navigating the world in ways to support communication and regulation and all things related to speech and language, the field. And so we made goals developed for fixing and changing and adapting to the neuromajority. We weren't trained in neurodiverse affirming practices.
Nobody was talking about it.
Nobody was talking about it. And I even, just some background, I grew up with a sister in special ed and with an IEP and globally developmentally delayed. And I have a cousin with a son with autism, and I have dyslexia myself. It was undiagnosed until I learned about what it was in the first place. But so neurodivergent was all around me, but it just wasn't what we talked about. And then I got into the field, and I was really passionate and still am about social emotional learning. And a lot of what we do is breaking down the abstract to make it more concrete, really helping others understand what's going on so they can navigate the world socially and emotionally. And an amazing speech pathologist, Suzanne Truesdale, came up with the concept of whole body listening to break down what we're talking about when we say, pay attention to me, listen to me. I mean, how many times do educators and parents say that over and over and over again? And really, what are we asking? And she actually asked a group of first grade kids in a class that she was in, like, what does it mean to listen? And they all called out, sit still, eyes looking, mouth quiet. So it became this whole article on what you turn on and what you turn off when it comes to listening. And it was helpful in like getting people, educators and adult facilitators, to stop saying, listen to me and pay attention to me, because what really are we asking? It's just confusing. So we started using it in my center. I had a multidisciplinary center in Oakland, California, with amazing therapists, social and emotional work, and executive functioning and sensory, all the things, speech therapy. And we were really creative. And one of our therapists, Kristen Wilson, came up with the character whole body listening Larry and put him on a stick. And the kids were like, yeah, this is great. So did lessons and visuals and all the things that were fun. And then I suggested, let's write a book, because that's what my brain does. And so we found a publisher and wrote 2 children's books, Whole Body Listening at Home and Whole Body Listening at School. And we have a poster, and it got really popular. It gets in mainstream kindergarten classes. And it's one of the foundational concepts that they teach when you first enter elementary school. So we're like, this is great. It's helpful. And then we started hearing from the autistic community that it was ableist. And frankly, I never even heard of that word. I was like, what does that mean? And so I'm this super compassionate, sensitive person. So I was like, oh my God, like, what's going on here? And I researched and was like, okay, I see that. Let me explain what I mean by that. When you have a poster that says, look at me, sit still, listen, it's performative. We're asking for compliance and conformity and performance, and not really thinking about the person. We're thinking about the speaker. And some people listen better, including myself and my kids. Both of my kids have ADHD and different ways of learning. Listen best when they move around and not when they're looking directly at somebody. So I came to the publisher and said, we need to change this. And so we did. We changed the book a little bit, and I wrote an article on it's a tool, not a rule, but it just wasn't enough. So I started, talking to more autistic individuals and the neurodivergent community. We had a focus group, and determined I just didn't really want to be involved in that work anymore. And so they were in agreement to take it down, but they said, please, don't just take it down, because what else are teachers and parents going to do? So we decided to make a new one, and we used Larry because Larry was known. And so if that's branding. So if somebody says, oh, Larry has a new thing, I'm already using Larry. What is Larry talking about now? Then that's going to pique their interest. So we made a whole new poster, and it's free on our website. And we made a new website called Everyday Regulation, and also a children's book, a rhyming children's book called Listen, Learn, and Grow. And so that's the story behind everything. And the background of the question that you asked of how it became is because that's what we were trained to do, is focus on breaking down the abstract to make it more concrete, and also focused on ways to support navigating in a neurotypical world.
Yeah. Well, and what you're talking about, that breaking down and using really clear, explicit instructions is actually very neurodiversity affirming.
Absolutely.
So the premise of it, like the way that you were approaching it made sense as far as telling kids, like, what are people looking for? But again, it is kind of just that next step that has come out of this neurodiversity movement and the community really talking about things. And I do find it interesting because I used it as a tool.
Yes.
It was very prevalent in the educational settings and even in the counseling world. There were times that I would, talk to kids about this as well, as far as having them even come up with some of their own things. But I think that's kind of the piece that shifts a little bit, because I know for me, as someone who is neurodivergent, I always kind of chuckle when I think about it now, because I promise you, I can be making eye contact and sitting very still and not hear a word that somebody is saying. My fidget right now is this little bent up paper clip that I'm using, but it actually helps me engage. And so I think as neurodivergent adults especially have kind of found their voice and are advocating and are realizing, like, we need to be more flexible with how we understand what this really looks like.
I think that's so important for us to be just curious. It's not to say that we're absolutely sharing what it means when people say things and breaking it down. And then there's the other piece of it. It's just curiosity for what works for you. And that is why we, put on there, it says, how does your body help you listen? Oh, and I also want to mention that I got some consulting and worked with McAllister Wen, who is the neurodivergent teacher. And she said, whole body listening is not a bad thing to do when we're talking about neurodiversity affirming practices. It's just how we're talking about it.
Right.
It's the same body parts. It's all the same body parts. Eyes, brain, body, feet, mouth, ears, heart, hands. But what helps you? And all brains and bodies are different and what works best for you. And some people, it does work best to look at the speaker and to sit still and have crisscross applesauce. Not me. And sounds like not you and not my children. So making them do that, if they're doing, quote, what they're supposed to be doing and compliant or whatever, it actually takes more cognitive load. And that in itself is dysregulating and is the opposite of our goal, which in a listening environment is to process the information.
So thinking about regulation specifically, we're asking students, of all ages, to be able to identify specifically what works and what doesn't for them as far as how they learn best. What I actually really liked about Listen, Learn, and Grow was that you go through so many of these different options. Like, does it look like this? Does it look like that? Like, what does it feel like for you? Just to help kids use that metacognitive process to think about what works for them. And we can do that even at a very young age.
Yeah. And that's super important to be able to understand, as teachers and educators and parents at home, what is regulation, and that it is a developmental skill. We all are working on regulation every day, no matter how old we are and if it's delayed or not. And so just being able to spend some time and really teach this and really get curious about our learners and who might need a little extra support in these areas, because this conversation can go in many different directions where in terms of, like, is it interoceptive awareness or is it anxiety or what might be getting in the way of being able to regulate in various situations. But one of the ways to do that is through going through each body part and focusing on something like listening, if that is where they might be struggling or might need a little extra support, and determine what really works for them. Then that's where the regulation comes, is building a toolbox.
Right.
Understanding what might be underlying. We talk about the tip of the iceberg, right? What we see on the outside. And that's not always regulated either, because you can see somebody on the outside that looks like they're listening, and internally they could be having a lot of anxiety, or that's when we talk about the zones, we talk about it's the feelings we have on the inside, understanding that, and then figuring out what's going on the outside so that we can figure out what it is that we have to navigate in each and every moment to then figure out what to do.
One of the pieces that I'm also thinking about this is the shift for us as educators or parents as well. One factor that kind of goes along with this is when we talk about co-regulation. Can you talk a little bit about how co-regulation really fits in with this work?
Co-regulation is the foundation of regulation. So not just listening, but every situation, because we're sharing energy, and, babies can't survive unless they have adults around them that are taking care of them. And then they build the neural pathways for regulation and supporting all the way through. But so when we have a child, they are constantly leaning on other people to support, to coach, to assist. And we as adults do that. We've really steered away from the term self-regulation because it's kind of a misnomer to be completely independently regulated, like nobody is, or very few people are. And if they are completely isolated, I would say that they're probably not very regulated. And so we all lean on each other. And so the co-regulation piece is for us to show up with a compassionate lens and curiosity and the ability to say, do you want to walk and talk? Would that be, good for you right now? Do you need a little break? Or how you feeling? What zone are you in? Whatever that might look like to help with the co-regulation piece. And then even before that is I do a lot of work with other educators who are focused on, and I do a lot of work with supporting parents on being regulated themselves. So the adult facilitator, whether you're doing educator wellness or supporting parents at home, or it starts with us. And in our course, that's the biggest. The foundation is taking care of ourselves so that we can model that and exude that when we're around others, because, a dysregulated adult cannot help a dysregulated child. We just add to it. So sharing our calm versus our chaos is so critical for this.
It's interesting, actually, as we're having this conversation, one of the things I'm thinking about is how much the emotion of shame is aligned both with the whole body listening, but also with the parents, or the educators recognizing their own emotions. Like, I think sometimes as adults, like, we are humans, we have emotions. We have these immediate knee-jerk reactions to things that maybe we weren't expecting, that are based on our own experiences or whatever. And then somehow there ends up feeling sometimes this fear of calling that what it is, to recognize a level of vulnerability, to go, gosh, I didn't respond to that the way I wish I would have. But modeling that for kids, but then also, like, the parallel I'm thinking there too is, when we have these certain expectations for children to do something a certain way, if they don't, then they're internalizing that shame that they haven't been able to live up to that. But when we think about being neurodiversity affirming in general, it's kind of like recognizing all of those pieces.
I am so grateful for you right now for bringing up this really hard piece of the conversation. And I love talking about, even though I have a pit in my stomach right now as I'm noticing the dysregulation. Are you familiar with Brene Brown's work? I love her work. And for those who are not familiar, she talks a lot about vulnerability and shame, and how when we don't talk about it, it just grows. It's like a petri dish. So it's like with my friends that I do a lot of healing work with, we play the shame game. And so it's like just calling it out. And it's just, we don't do that in our culture. And that was one of the reasons why I just was really called to make the change with the resources and, dive in deep. Because some of my colleagues are like, oh my God, I can't believe you did that. I would have run for the hills. And, it's just like a biggest fear to be called out like that publicly of doing something that you absolutely didn't mean to do. So I feel like with vulnerability, having Larry, using him as having a huge growth mindset and saying like, oops, I needed to evolve, and do something different. That's a whole lesson in itself. And it's something that we work on a lot at home. My younger son especially struggles with the growth mindset and a lot of shame and blame. And so it's huge. It's a huge piece of this. So I welcome that conversation as well. Thanks for bringing that up.
I guess I want to validate the fact that when you created whole body listening, Larry, or the SLP in your office, but then wrote the book and put it out there and all those things, you were articulating something that many people were already kind of implementing in various ways. Like, I think that's again a piece for so many neurodivergent parents who are thinking, we have internalized so many things from our own childhood, and we learn from our past experiences. But we do have to have this opportunity for the self-reflection to recognize like where we want to shift those things and identify like, I know why I'm having that knee-jerk reaction to this. It's because somebody else used to have this reaction to me when I would do those things. Just really thinking about it and being okay with that discomfort, which is, like you said, not always easy.
Yeah, our brain is programmed to, it's protecting us, right? To, you did something wrong, you're bad. And that's where the shame comes from. And, even if it's a place of like, I didn't know, that's a whole mindset shift that I didn't have. It's still, something that is looked at as wrong because it did, cause harm and shame for people who are using the whole body listening in a way of a behavioral way. God forbid, clip up things about if they weren't sitting still or looking or whatever. It's my worst nightmare to think about that. And that's why I'm so passionate about getting this out there to people who might still be doing it that way. And again, not in a way of shaming those people, because educators and adults who have kids around them, whether you're parenting or teaching or you're in therapy, we all have the mindset of caring for kids. That's the common goal. Let's just all get that straight. And so if we come to each other with curiosity and modeling evolution and change and vulnerability, then it opens the door for other people to think differently too. I will say though, and I'm just going to be vulnerable in saying this, and I might get pushback, but I don't think it's healthy in the world of the neurodiversity affirming practices movement for us to be polarized and to, have a lot of shame within that movement. I think it's because of my dyslexic brain. I was able to take that without taking it so personally, because everything has just been, in the world has been sort of difficult without knowing I had dyslexia and just sort of figuring things out. And I probably grew up with a lot of shame. I did, So when somebody said like, this is ableist, it wasn't like a knee-jerk reaction, like I always do everything right in the world, now I'm a bad person. It's like, oh, here's another incident of like, I screwed up, or I don't know what this means. What does this mean? And try to help and figure it out and problem solve through it. So I just invite people who maybe have a knee-jerk reaction, because even colleagues that I love, and who have been alongside me through the whole thing, they're like, well, I still think there's a place for the old whole body listening poster, and I'm going to use that. And I said, I would recommend that you don't, because you can still use that this works for some people to sit still and look. But let's look at the whole picture and taking away the blame and shame. But I think that there is a piece of like holding on to that they haven't done anything wrong.
When I consider this, I feel that dynamic in the neurodiversity community that you're talking about. And I understand where it comes from. I also think that calling people out is not actually the way to facilitate change. It's much more about calling people in and validating the things like you were just talking about. Why are we doing this work? We're doing this work because we care about kids. And it's a growing process, but recognizing that we have to continue to move forward with all of those different things. And also recognizing, like for the teacher who you mentioned, who, is so used to using the one thing and feels like there's a place for it. Maybe it's a both and, right? Like that's what you're saying. It's using it as a tool. But when people feel called out, that shame is one of the biggest barriers that will prevent them from actually making those changes. So many people, the immediate reaction is to dig in your heels and feel kind of defensive. Like that's that immediate reaction. Again, understandably for why that happens, but it's sometimes hard to break free from that.
So I love what you said, the calling out versus calling in. That's just amazing. And that's so how I think and believe. And I'll tell you right now, I had the knee-jerk reaction when, Larry was called an ableist because I felt like I was being called an ableist. And I'm like, you don't know me. I grew up with a sister who was bullied and I was bullied because of it. This is a passion of mine.
Right.
So, and it was funny, actually, somebody I got on a call with, because I'm just very open and I love communicating and sharing, and I'm humble and like being public about the things that I've done wrong, or I shouldn't say wrong, but I'm learning about. And somebody like who had called me out on social media or called Larry out, and a lot of it is attention getting, ripping up stuff, and all the different things. And I get it; it got my attention. So that when we talked, they were like, "Oh, there's actually a person behind this."
Yes.
And I'm like, "Yeah," and a really curious, compassionate person.
Right.
So like, I think that I love that call in versus call out. And I've been doing trainings around this as well, and focusing on, what happened and the need for focusing on regulation, and then focusing more on what really is involved with listening, which I've done work with Sarah Ward on trainings around executive functioning. And so in that training, we talk a lot about unlearning. And also what's involved in that is the grief process. I talk about the Kubler-Rosses. So that's part of it, is the knee-jerk reaction, and then just, following the stages of grief and being able to unlearn something. And I will never say that in the neurodiversity affirming practices movement that I am in the unconscious, now I'm forgetting the last stage, but it's just like where it's just second nature, like tying your shoe, because things are always changing and there's just so many differences and ways to look at things. So I would never say that I was at that stage ever.
That's interesting. I've never thought about it this way. When you're talking about the stages of grief, as a mental health counselor, I'm thinking of like denial, anger, bargaining. There's another one. And then acceptance, I think, is the fifth one. There might be a couple more out there. I think there are a couple different versions. But I can see how that plays out. I'm not doing anything wrong, right? Like that's the denial piece of it. And then like maybe that outward anger, at somebody else for, again, that feeling of calling out, which is, again, that defensiveness. And then that bargaining. I had to do this because, of this other thing. Or if I do this, then I can't, whatever. And I think validating that for people is probably really helpful, to call that what it is. To call that like, yeah, there's a grieving process for recognizing like, I have to let go of this thing that maybe was, I thought, really helpful or really important, or again, just the idea that I thought I was doing something right and now I know better, so I need to shift it and do something a little bit differently.
Yeah. I mean, I called my old clients that I was really close with and, started talking to them about all of this. And, some of them weren't even really that involved in neurodiversity movement. And so it was new to them a little bit. Like, I thought it was helpful.
Yeah.
And then I started like feeling like I needed to educate them. Well, actually it's not. So I want to help you advocate for you.
Yeah. I'll just add there, I think that there is a time and a place. Like, is it helpful for somebody to know that that's maybe what others are looking for in certain situations? I would say yes.
Oh, yes.
Does it mean that you have to do it at all times? I think that's where it shifts.
And that's where the advocacy piece comes in. Because it's like McAllister told me one time, and it totally like light bulb moment of it's, we're like cross-cultural interpreters. So helping really understand the landscape.
Totally.
Because, it's really overwhelming when you're in a foreign country to know street signs and where everything is and how to communicate. So helping navigate these situations and say, just so you know, like I am right now, I am paying attention. I'm just looking outside because it helps me think.
This has been such a great conversation. And just so everybody kind of knows, when we were first emailing, I had sent a variety of different topics to kind of cover. And as we were talking, you had pointed out like so many of these are an entire episode.
Yes.
just on their own. And so I'm so glad that we had this opportunity to take this deep dive, really talking about, the whole body listening, moving to the whole body regulation. As we wrap up, what are some of your thoughts that you would really like to leave with people as far as how you would like to call them into this process? What words would you like to share as far as how they engage with this shift, reflect on their own practices, and try to move toward more neurodiversity affirming ideas?
That's a great question. Let's start with the one that maybe can help with, I think, what's just going to make the biggest shift, which is really helping with the mindset shift of the shame piece of it. So I think that if we can just validate that, yeah, this is different, and like I'm telling myself, like I didn't do anything intentionally wrong. Like when somebody threw out the words to me, like this has caused shame and harm, I just think, oh my gosh, like you don't know me. I'm not that person. I care about others. And so I just want to really like let this settle in for those who might be hearing this for the first time, might have know others or have a poster on your wall with old Larry, the green poster that talks about, sit still, look at me, all the different things. And just know that it's okay. And it's a matter of getting curious and taking the time to listen, because I say oftentimes that kids will listen when they feel heard. And so I feel the same for adults. So thank you so much for having this forum, for being able to have these open conversations with vulnerability, to show an example of evolution and how we can look at things differently, and how it might be really overwhelming for a lot of kids to sit still, listen, and look, and in the ways that we have traditionally been taught. And so we'll have to have a whole new podcast on really like what to do and how, because it can be overwhelming for teachers, I will say, especially, and parents at home, to know how to set up an environment doesn't feel chaotic, for allowing each kid to explore how they listen and learn best. But it is essential for true processing and not adding another layer on of cognitive load so that they have to mask or do things that are really strenuous for them in the learning process. So that's what the compliance piece is all about. And that's what I'd like to start in terms of really just listening and pausing with other educators and adults as we're having this conversation, so that it doesn't come across as the shame game, the blame game.
Yeah, 100%. Elizabeth Sautter, thank you so much for your time today.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
I talk a lot about self-advocacy, about how important it is for kids to be able to express their needs, ask for accommodations, and push back when something isn't working for them. But what I don't talk about as much is how emotionally complicated it can be. Because there's a fine line between empowering a child to advocate for themselves and accidentally placing the burden on them to fix a system that wasn't designed for them in the first place. And sometimes that's what it feels like. Like we're asking kids to be their own best advocates instead of asking adults to do better. And that's a weight I feel every time I encourage a student to speak up, knowing that they might not be heard the way they deserve to be. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Thanks again to Elizabeth Sautter for her time. If you'd like more info on her or her work, we'll include some links in the show notes. Hey, I wanted to let you know we have something called the Therapist Hub. It's a place for mental health professionals of all levels and credentials to get together and share ideas on how to make your practices more neurodiversity affirming. There's a vibrant forum, continuing education resources, which, by the way, are accredited by the National Board of Certified Counselors, and it's available in a phone app or web browser. We will open enrollment for the Therapist Hub very soon. We've included a link in the show notes to be alerted when that time comes. Our host, that's Emily Kircher-Morris. Corey Orick is our office manager and production assistant. I'm the executive producer, Dave Morris. For all of us, thank you for listening. And we'll see you next time. This is a service of the Neurodiversity Alliance,